National Catholic Register. This is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
Over 5,700 children from 2019 to 2023 had sex change surgeries. More than twice that many children were prescribed puberty blockers. These troubling figures are from a new report by a watchdog group, Do No Harm. EWTN News has identified 150 Catholic hospitals among those that provided these services. National Catholic Register staff writer Matthew McDonald brings us the story. Then we turn to our Vatican Bureau, where Register Senior Editor Jonathan Liedl provides us another report from the Synod on Synodality. I'm Jeanette DeMello, host of Register Radio, together with Matthew Bunson, my co-host and EWTN News' Vice President and Editorial Director, who is currently in Rome for the final week of the Synod. The medical watchdog group Do No Harm published a database of public hospital records that catalogs nearly 14,000 sex change-related treatments for children under age 17. And these were provided by healthcare facilities over a 5-year period from 2019 to 2023. And as I mentioned, EWTN has found that Catholic hospitals were among those that provided these services. Matthew McDonald, staff writer for the National Catholic Register, reported on this story. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Jeanette.
So you worked with Tyler Arnold from Catholic News Agency on this report, and both of you dug deep into this database, looking at the Catholic healthcare facilities that were involved. Who were they? What did you find?
About 150 Catholic hospitals from 89 dioceses in 40 states. So really across the country had some services that they provided for gender transition. Some of them very few, as many as few as one prescription in 5 years. But 33 hospitals provided gender transition surgeries.
That's devastating. I mean, these surgeries are something that changes a child forever, right? And it's appalling that this would be happening in a Catholic facility, because not only because it affects these children's lives forever, but it's also against the Church's teaching. Who we teach the Church's teaches that it's immoral, for these to assist in these gender transitions. Can you summarize what these Catholic hospitals should know about this subject?
The Church teaches, first and foremost, that we must have compassion for everybody, but particularly people who are struggling with gender identity. This is a very difficult thing, as I think all our listeners know. The people who go through this have intense internal struggles. Just on a personal note, I coached baseball a few years ago with a player who was going through this, and the player's mom was in a lot of distress, as was the player. Mm-hmm. But the question is, what does compassion look like? And one side says it's to affirm this transition and help the adolescent, usually, to, if the adolescent is a boy, to become a girl or some other gender, a girl to become a boy or some other gender. The Church's teaching is that God created us male and female, as it says in Genesis, and that God doesn't make mistakes when he creates human beings. So if there's distress about feeling trapped in a body, the problem is not the body, the problem is internal.
It's very well said, and of course the teachings of the Church have been very clear on this, not only from Pope Francis and the popes before him, but also from the U.S. bishops, who in March 2023 gave some specific instruction that interventions must not entities must not perform interventions, whether surgical or chemical, that aim to transform the sexual characteristics of a human body into those of the opposite sex, or take part in such development. And that was a note from the United States Bishops' Committee on Doctrine in March 2023. Matthew, I cut you off. You were going to jump on in. Come on.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that, that the bishops with their ethical and religious directives, the so-called ERDs, I mean, this is something that every diocese is aware of. And I guess one of the questions a lot of people ask is, where are the bishops in this? And what can we anticipate is going to follow, given the many challenges that bishops have now even controlling Catholic hospitals?
This is an interesting question because, as you point out, bishops don't have direct authority over Catholic hospitals. Once upon a time, just about every Catholic hospital was run by a religious order or a diocese. Today, they're run by larger companies that often are in several states, and it's a indirect relationship that they have with the local bishop. The bishop doesn't control the hospital directly, not really even indirectly. The only things that are open to a bishop are to talk to hospital officials privately, or to make public statements, or to yank the Catholic identity of a hospital, which is the kind of the nuclear option. But those are the only three things that they really can do. In terms of the ethical and religious directives, the bishops may be interested in updating them. In 2018 is the last time that they were updated. And to give you an idea of how fast-moving this topic is, this gender transitioning topic is not mentioned in the ethical and religious directives because in 2018 it wasn't at the forefront of their thinking.
Yeah, that's right, and it's a pretty big issue now as we've seen the uptick for the last 5 years. So this report from Do No Harm is really helpful, I think, to get a sense of how frequent this is. Can you tell us, Matt, a little bit more about this group and how they collected the data? Just how did this study go?
It's a medical watchdog group that takes a dim view of gender transitioning. And Do No Harm says that they collected data that's publicly available from health insurance companies, that's private health insurance companies, and from federal agencies like Medicare and Medicaid and the United States Veterans Administration. So they used medical coding to figure out what services hospitals were providing and then created a database over the course of several months and published it.
Very good. And as you mentioned, there were so many Catholic facilities that were doing this across the country, some more than others. And you and Tyler reached out to the bishops across the country, I think to every diocese. How many responded? And what did they have to say?
The vast majority did not respond or decline comment. The ones that responded, there were a few that said that they were appalled. Bishop Robert Barron, for instance. And then I spoke with Bishop Thomas Daly of the Diocese of Spokane, Eastern Washington, and he's calling for a special meeting of the bishops to discuss this matter because he finds it disturbing.
Matt, you also talked to the Catholic Conference in Ohio. This is a place where there were 14 Catholic facilities that assisted in transitioning. I found the response from Ohio, from the Bishop of Toledo, as well as the Ohio Catholic Conference, very interesting. I'd love for you to describe what they had to say, but I think it also highlights something that you mentioned earlier in the show, which is that the Catholic bishops are not as involved as you might expect in these Catholic facilities. So how did Ohio highlight that situation?
The Diocese of Toledo spokesman told me about an audit that Bonsecker Mercy Health in Cincinnati performed of its hospitals. And the audit is supposed to examine how the hospitals are following the ethical and religious directives of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The diocese spokesman says that the findings in the Do No Harm database are inconsistent with the audit. So I asked the health system spokesman about it. I did not receive a direct response to questions such as, have you been performing gender transitioning surgeries? And this has been common with all of the health organizations that we've contacted so far. We've gotten defenses of their activities, but no actual direct responses about whether they're performing these gender transitioning surgeries. The larger question, I think, is what can the bishops do about it? What sort of relationship do they have? It appears to me that these audits are something that a bishop might use to figure out if the hospital is following the ethical and religious directives. Mm-hmm. And now I think there's some confusion as to whether the audits are coming up with this particular activity or not.
Yeah, Matt, real quick. a lot of people wonder about the motivations for why a Catholic hospital, for example, would abandon these principles, reject the ERDs, for example. Is there any sense of why they're doing these surgeries? There's obviously potential for profitability and other things, but is that something that you've been able to look at?
It is to a point. It's a little frustrating to me, the indirect answers that we've gotten so far. I hope actually that they'll address this more directly, because I think they do have things to say. But what I read between the lines of some of the statements that we've gotten is that they're trying to walk hand in hand with people who feel same-sex attraction and people who feel gender identity incongruence, let's say, and that they're trying to serve them. If that's the case, that's coming from a good place in their heart. The question is this actually a good thing for them? The Church says no. And I'd like to hear more about what these Catholic hospitals and Catholic health systems have to say. Why do they think it is a good idea? We haven't heard that directly.
Very interesting, Matt. I know you are going to be continuing to cover this, and as one of the bishops told you, they hope to discuss it at a meeting in the future. We know it's not on the agenda for the bishops' November meeting, but maybe this will come up in some way, and something will be scheduled so that the Catholic hospitals and the bishops can come together with true compassion for these children. The story that Matt wrote is in the October 20th edition, print edition of the Register, and it is called Report Nearly 150 Catholic Hospitals Provided Transgender Surgeries or Drugs to Children. To stay up to date with this, go to ncregister.com and you'll find 2 stories on this topic. So you've been listening to Register Radio on EWTN News. When we come back, we'll be talking to Jonathan Liedl about the final week of the Synod. Stay tuned to Register Radio on EWTN.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Jeanette DeMello, host of Register Radio.
And I'm Matthew Bunson, EWTN News' Vice President and Editorial Director, and happily honored to be co-host of Register Radio with Jeanette. Well, the month-long gathering of the final assembly of the Synod on Synodality began on October 2nd and will draw to a close with the Papal Mass on October 27th. The assembly, of course, consists of more than 400 people from around the world. Of those gathered, 368 are voting members called delegates, 272 of whom are bishops and 96 are non-bishops. Among the 96 non-bishops, about half are women. The Register senior editor, Jonathan Liedl, has been reporting from Rome since the start of the Synod, and he joins us now. Jonathan, it's great to be with you, to be able to spend some time with you in Rome as we've been this week.
Yeah, likewise, Matthew.
Well, we've been getting reports from the Synod each week here on Register Radio. As with the first Synod assembly at the Vatican last October, the media have been getting rather limited access to what's actually happening in the Synod Hall. The participants are not supposed to talk to the media, and they're supposed to rely on the official press conferences for information that can be of, let's just say, limited value. This week, though, you've covered another aspect that tends to drive messages around the Synod. Your very helpful article was titled How Special Interest Advocacy Works at the Synod on Synodality. Let's talk about that. What's going on with these advocacy groups?
Well, you're exactly, Matthew. As we know, Pope Francis took some controversial issues off the Synod agenda this year. So conversations related to the possibility of women diaconate and things related to LGBTQ issues. He handed those over to study groups so the Synod could focus on synodality. But here in Rome, over the past few weeks, there have been a number of these advocacy groups on the kind of edges of the Synod, sort of agitating and trying to keep these issues front and center in media coverage about the Synod. And so, in the article, the way this typically works is they'll hold some kind of event on the sidelines to the Synod. They'll try to draw press attention, try to even draw a handful of Synod participants and speaking. And then next thing you know, the next news wave of the Synod on Synodality, the next media cycle is dominated by these issues that Pope Francis didn't necessarily want it to be about, right? So this continual push for, attempted ordination of women, continual push for modification in the church's approach to issues like same-sex attraction. And really, I mean, honestly, I think the best way to think about it is to think about lobbying. The way lobbying works in the United States politics, you have special interest groups that have the time, the resources, and the kind of particular focus to determine that, hey, we're going to come to Rome, we're going to be here throughout this synod, and we're going to try to make some noise. And really, I think the goal is to make it seem, by using media, by using mass media, to make it seem like these issues, right, have like a significant degree of support, right? And that then maybe potentially puts pressure, creates dynamics in the synod hall where people feel like, oh, this issue needs to be talked about in some way. So it's just it honestly seems like it's coming from the realm of partisan politics, not the church serenely discerning, but it's really a pressure tactic meant to influence the synod. And I think just one final thought on that is, we've talked a lot about the synod as it's really trying to hear from all the people of God. So from the local level now all the way up to the universal. But to what degree is that kind of circularity and listening that Pope Francis has really highlighted undercut by these, well-organized, agenda-driven groups coming to Rome and trying to hijack the narrative? So I think that's something important to keep in mind. And I think it might have an impact in the Synod Hall, but I don't think the delegates overall are necessarily going to be, overly influenced or steered by these advocacy groups.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeanette.
Yeah, one of these topics I think that is actually on the agenda, it was a part of the Instrumentum Laboris, and that's the document that was put out in the summer that should guide the discussions of the Synod. One of those topics, unlike the ones that are in the special interest lobby groups, and every time you mentioned in the article sidelines, I just kept thinking the side show, really. But anyway, so one discussion was on decentralization, and something we've talked about here, Jonathan, before on radio. But we know that the 5 different language groups met for a discussion on decentralization. They met for discussions on lots of things, but decentralization came up in their summary reports. And you wrote that there was pushback to this topic and some of the aspects of decentralization. So, what were their concerns? What was the nature of this discussion, and what were the concerns that you've heard from some Synod participants?
Absolutely, yeah, Jeanette. This conversation that took place earlier this week was by far, I think, the most dramatic day yet at the Synod on Synodality. And what they're specifically discussing is a proposal in the Instrumentum Laboris to recognize Episcopal conferences. So we think National Bishops' Conferences, the USCCB is one example that listeners might know, but to give these Episcopal conferences juridical status and to give them doctrinal authority. So to basically allow certain doctrinal questions to be settled at the level of bishops' conferences. And the reason why this was so contentious and why, several sources inside the Synod told us about significant pushback on this is a real fear that decentralizing doctrinal authority will essentially fragment the unity of the church's faith, like its teaching on faith and morals. And there's good reason to think this, because who has been advocating for decentralization of doctrinal authority most forcefully? Well, the Germans are a great example. The people pushing for the synodal way in Germany really see decentralization as key for then allowing them to move forward to some of these changes to the church's teaching on sexuality, to the church's teaching on sacramental ordination. Another related example might be in the Amazon. Of course, there was a lot of controversy a few years ago during the Amazonian Synod on the question of ordaining married men. So if a regional bishops' conference becomes given sort of the authority to decide something like that, we take it out of the Vatican, the universal level, which is trying to maintain the integrity of the faith across the world. You could have those changes there. And I think the concern is, well, if you fracture the teaching of the church, you fracture its unity. And then obviously if something happens in a place like Germany, it's going to affect the rest of the universal church, right? It's going to embolden, advocacy groups in other parts of the world to continue that as well. So I think there is a fruitful conversation to be had about what issues are a matter of enculturation, right? What authority might a bishops' conference have to take something from the Catholic faith and apply it in a particular way in their local context? But then what are those doctrinal issues that are essential for the unity of the church? So yeah, Synod delegates, they said there has not been this much pushback on any issue in the session this far. There were a number of speeches made inside the Synod Hall raising these kinds of concerns. And it actually prompted, in something that sources told us was completely unprecedented, it prompted organizers to call one of their theological experts up to sort of try to explain the issue, to assuage concerns, and to get people on board with it. But I think, Jeanette, this issue of decentralization and doctrinal authority for bishops' conferences is probably the single most important one at the Synod on Synodality. And so we're really going to be looking to see what happens with this issue as we move towards the final document.
Absolutely.
Well, we know, Jonathan, that this weekend there will be the canonizations of 14 new saints, 11 martyrs from Damascus, Mother Elena Guerra, Giuseppe Alamano, and Marie Leonie Paradis, so two foundresses of important congregations and the Consolata missionaries on the part of Alamano. This sort of sets the stage for the final week here in Rome. So what should we be looking for next week from the Synod?
Well, yeah, with those canonizations happening this weekend, in terms of the Synod this next week, it's the final countdown, right? This is the Synod delegates will be presented with a draft of a final document, and they'll be able to talk about that. They'll be able to provide amendments, and then they'll vote on it on October 26th, the last working day of the Synod. So they'll be voting on this whole Synod on Synodality that really started in 2021 is now culminating now. This will be the sort of final output of it, right? And then, well, what happens after that? If Pope Francis goes the route of previous synods, right, he will write a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. He'll take the findings, the proposals of this synod into account and write his own teaching document on it. But one thing a lot of us are keeping our eye on is the possibility that Pope Francis could simply take the document submitted to him by the Synod on Synodality and could endow it with magisterial authority. And he could do this because of a change that he made in canon law in 2018. And a lot of people, even at the Synod, have been mentioning this as a possibility. They've almost been encouraging the Pope to do this with the idea that if he does it, it will recognize synods, which of course now include lay participation at this Synod. It will recognize synods as sort of decision-making magisterial bodies. So that would be quite a significant shift. As one theological expert, Donata Horak, called it, would be a paradigm shift. So we're just keeping an eye this last week on how that final document will shake out, and then, of course, what Pope Francis does with it.
Yes, there's so much to watch, Jonathan. I mean, the Synod seems sometimes like it drags on because it's a whole month long, but really this is the key week, and there's a lot of play in it. And so thank you so much to both of you, Matthew and Jonathan, who are there on the ground. Reporting from our Vatican Bureau. I want to point to the print edition, of course, because in the October 20th print edition, a lot of these articles that we've been talking about were there. The cover page was Setting a Synodal Course, and we also had an article in that. It was on Is the Next Pope at the Synod? Very, very interesting article by Jonathan talking about some of the key players there, some of the cardinals who were there. And of course, we have some cardinal elects, new cardinals who are on the ground there as well. Another article was on personal experience, not moral absolutes, steering the group's discernment on sexual questions and how this might raise some problems. We also have the upcoming November 3rd edition that will have some of this final week reporting. So I invite our listeners to go to ncregister.com and also to sign up to get the register in the print edition, because it's really a special package to read each week. So check out ncregister.com for commentary, analysis, and news. at ncregister.com. As always, thanks for joining us here on Register Radio on EWTN. Until next week, on behalf of my producer Michael McCall and Matthew Bunson, my co-host, I'm Jeanette DeMello, and I pray that God bless you.